This video is based on a series created by Jeremy Klinger. If you haven't seen them, then I highly recommend checking those videos out because they're very good. Dr. Neo Cortex. As the main villain of the Crash Bandicoot universe, he has a prominent role in almost every single game in the series, but how effective he truly is varies. In some games he's a genuinely menacing threat, while in others he's an absolute joke. So today I'm going to take a look at Cortex's role in each Crash game and rank how effective he is in each one. In the original Crash Bandicoot, Cortex has successfully taken over an entire island and made it the stronghold for his operations, and his influence can even be felt as far as the two neighboring islands, though to a much lesser extent. He creates an entire army of superpowered mutant animals to serve him in his quest for world domination, but his plan hits a snag when his intended general, Crash Bandicoot, is rejected by the machine that would brainwash him to do Cortex's bidding. His plan is a pretty typical world domination plot, but the fact that he's had enough influence to affect the ecosystem of not just his own island, but the two right next to it is actually pretty impressive, and enough for me to rank him as pretty menacing in this game. In Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex abducts Crash and claims that he needs to collect crystals in order to contain the energy from an impending planetary alignment that will destroy the Earth if not controlled. This, of course, turns out to be a lie, and Cortex really plans on using the force from the crystals and the planetary alignment to power up his Cortex Vortex and brainwash the entire planet with a single blast from it. His true plan isn't revealed until the very end of the game, when Coco stops and warns Crash right as he is about to deliver all 25 crystals to Cortex. Tricking Crash into doing all of the work for him was honestly pretty clever on Cortex's part, and the fact that this is probably the closest he's ever gotten to actually succeeding in taking over the world is pretty terrifying. So all in all, I think this deserves a top tier ranking. Crash Bandicoot Warped introduces us to Uka Uka, who turns out to have been the true mastermind behind all of Cortex's previous plots. While Cortex still plays a major role in this game, he largely takes a backseat to Uka Uka and doesn't do much outside of sending some enemies in Crash and Coco's way to try and stop them from collecting the crystals. All in all, this is pretty typical bad guy territory. In Crash Team Racing's Adventure Mode, Cortex is one of the 8 characters you can choose to play as, and if you do, he eventually is the one who earns the right to race against Oxide for the fate of the planet. This is a completely interchangeable role amongst all of the playable characters though, and there's nothing about Cortex specifically that distinguishes him from the rest. So I'm going to put this in the interchangeable player character tier, which I made because this is going to be a running trend for a lot of the spin-off multiplayer games. Crash Bash is another example of what I just described. If you choose to play as Cortex, then he's really no different than if you had chosen anybody else, and if you choose to play as any of the good characters, then there's a chance that Cortex will be one of the computer players you always compete against, in which case the only other thing of note he does is run away in fear at the end of the game when Uka Uka gets angry at him and Brio for their failure. If you pick one of the other 3 evil characters, then Cortex doesn't appear at all outside of the opening cutscene. I suppose the fact that he actually succeeds in assisting Uka Uka in world domination should you play as him counts for something, but he does basically nothing in any other scenario, so I'm once again ranking this as an interchangeable player character. In Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex, despite literally having his name in the title, Cortex once again takes a pretty big backseat. This time, however, not only does he play the role of Uka Uka's lackey, but he takes an even further backseat to both his own creation, Crunch, who serves as Crash's main obstacle for the entire game, and the elementals which Uka Uka awakens in order to give Crunch a power source. Even in his own final boss battle, which he shares with Crunch, Cortex still does basically nothing except watch Crash and Crunch fight and periodically get knocked down into the arena by Crunch for Crash to beat up. He does still kickstart the plot by creating Crunch in the first place. A vast majority of the enemies in the game are his lab assistants that are obviously doing his bidding, and a couple of the levels feature dialogue about things that he is specifically doing to threaten the planet, so Cortex isn't completely useless in this game, but he barely does anything. In Crash Bandicoot: The Huge Adventure, Cortex builds a planetary minimizer and uses it to shrink the Earth to fit in the palm of his hand, and probably destroys a few major cities with his fingertips in the process. It says a lot that Cortex actually succeeded in shrinking the Earth, but he doesn't really do anything afterwards except gloat, and it doesn't take much for Crash and Coco to easily undo the process. And even when he ends up accidentally fusing with the game's other villains, he still only manages to chase Crash off without actually defeating him. Seeing as the beginning of his plan actually works, I wouldn't say he barely does anything, but he never really capitalizes off of his success, so it's pretty typical bad guy stuff once again. Crash Bandicoot 2 Entranced is the only game in the series where Cortex doesn't appear at all, with his role as the main villain instead being taken up by Entropy. So, yeah. Compared to CTR, Crash Nitro Kart does give Cortex a bit more to do in cutscenes if you do choose to play as his team, and by that I mean he has some distinction. But even with that, he really isn't any more significant than any of the other playable characters, so this is another case of interchangeable player character. Because Crash Purple is a crossover with the Spyro series, Cortex once again takes a back seat so that Ripto can play the part of Crash's primary foe in this game. You do eventually fight the pair of them together at the very end of the game, and they're pretty handily defeated, and if teaming up with another bad guy isn't enough for you to defeat your enemies, then I'd say that makes you pretty worthless. In Crash Twin Sanity, Cortex arguably plays his largest role to date. For starters, as opposed to being the main villain, Cortex is one of the game's protagonists, being second in the role only to Crash himself. At the beginning, he tries to get revenge on Crash, only to fail miserably and in a fit of rage just rushes straight at him, causing a fist fight, which low-key might be the most effective strategy Cortex has ever employed. After this, he teams up with Crash to take down their mutual new enemy, the evil twins, who over the course of the game are gradually revealed to have a personal vendetta against Cortex. Throughout the game, Cortex does become the universe's personal chew toy, but he's not without his powerful moments. His Iceberg Lab serves as the central hub of the main characters, so to speak, and it's his machine, the Psychotron, that gives them the ability to take down the evil twins. It's also his idea to raid Engine's battleship in search for more crystals to power the machine and to recruit Nina, his niece, when the machine is damaged and needs repairs. And at the end of the game, when confronting the twins, Cortex both stands up to them and holds his own in battle against them. All of these factors combined makes Crash Twin Sanity an easy top-tier showing for Cortex. In Crash Tag Team Racing, Cortex is one of the many characters around Motorworld that you can help out by doing missions for him. As far as the plot itself goes, he plans to claim ownership of the theme park by finding the person who stole Von Clutch's Black Heart Power Gem, but nothing really amounts to this plan. He does end up being the person who defeats the culprit, Willy Wumpa Cheeks, by straight up murdering him, only to in turn be easily defeated by Crash. Cortex's showing in this game really isn't that impressive, but the fact that he's the one who defeats Willy stops him from being completely worthless, so I'll put this in barely does anything. I hate that I'm even acknowledging this game, but whatever. None of the characters in Crash Boom Bang really do anything, seeing as it's a party game in the loosest terms possible, and the story is the biggest excuse of a plot ever. Cortex does try to take the map to the Super Big Power Crystal from the Viscount, causing it to rip, but this doesn't really change much because they still find it anyway, and Crash still ends up using the one-time wish. Cortex is a playable character, so you could argue that this is another case of interchangeable player character, but since he's an unlockable character, and because this is genuinely the worst game I've ever played in my life, and it barely even qualifies as a game because you have to do fuck all to progress through it, I'm putting this in worthless. It doesn't deserve better. In Crash of the Titans, Cortex harnesses a new power source called Mojo in order to create an army of super mutants to take over Wumpa Island. He also captures both Aku Aku and Coco while incapacitating Crunch at the beginning of the game. However, he gets defeated by Crash really early on and is immediately replaced by Nina, who takes charge of his plan. He then spends the entire remainder of the game being one of Nina's captives alongside Coco and only escapes when Crash defeats her. Between his early defeat and spending the rest of the game imprisoned, this is by far one of Cortex's worst showings in the series and earns itself an easy worthless ranking. The DS version of Crash of the Titans actually has a completely different story from the console version, and in this one, Cortex plans on using the Mojo he's harnessed to power up his giant Cortex bot that he's created. It's eventually uncovered that the only thing he wants the robot to do is dance, which isn't really that evil. The ending of the game is different depending on whether or not you get 100% completion, but regardless, Cortex is defeated by either Crash or Nina. I will say that the fact that he doesn't get overthrown and imprisoned at the very beginning is enough to make Cortex not worthless in this game, but his plan is extremely silly, so I'd say that he barely does anything here. I'm not going to bother with the GBA version of Crash of the Titans, since its plot is pretty similar to the console version, with the major difference being that Cortex gets reinstated by Uka Uka after Nina is defeated. After a really long string of unimpressive showings, games where he wasn't the main villain, or both, Crash Mind Over Mutant serves as a massive return to form for Cortex. Right out of the gate, he punishes Nina's treachery from the previous game by forcing her to enroll in evil public school, putting her out of commission. He then teams up with Embryo and overthrows Uka Uka, the omnipotent mask that's been lording over him since Warped, completely usurping him and reclaiming his throne as the big bad of the series. Cortex and Embryo then create the NV, a device that allows them to brainwash every single mutant on Wumpa Island except for Crash, including Coco and Crunch. And the way they got the mutants to use the NV was by simply giving it to them and advertising it as a high-tech entertainment device, which is honestly one of Cortex's cleverer and more dastardly plots. It's only through the assistance of Nina and Uka Uka, both of whom want revenge against Cortex, that Crash is finally able to confront him in his space station, and even then, Cortex puts up a pretty good fight by using some of the mutant formula that Embryo left behind to turn into a superpowered version of himself. It takes the combined efforts of multiple characters to take down Cortex, and he doesn't go down easily, so between that and how effectively he takes the helm of main villain back from those who had outshined him in the past, this is easily another one of his best showings. Easy top tier. Much like Titan's GBA, I'm not going to cover the DS version of Mind Over Mutant, since its plot is a watered down version of the console game's plot. In fact, it's so watered down that I wouldn't even call it coherent, so yeah. Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, is an interesting one for Cortex. He immediately starts off the game essentially being a lackey to Entropy's plan to take over the various dimensions, although he does also manage to take over an entire dimension himself, if the signs of his presence in the 11th dimension are any indication. Cortex eventually gets backstabbed by Entropy, joins forces with the Bandicoots, and takes an active role in thwarting his plot. After that, he seizes the opportunity to double-cross the Bandicoots and use Kapunawa to go back in time to right before the first game, hoping to stop his past self from ever creating Crash. Cortex then gets into an incredibly vocal argument with his past self, who stubbornly believes he's an imposter, but he is eventually able to overpower his past self and is only stopped by the timely arrival of Crash and Coco. Cortex starts off the game not really being much of a threat, but between his role in putting a stop to Entropy and then once again re-establishing himself as the game's main villain, I'd say that earns his Crash 4 showing a spot in the pretty menacing tier. And there's our list. I'm not going to go over any of the mobile games because frankly I can't be bothered, and Crash Team Rumble has no story, so it obviously can't be included either. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments below. I wouldn't be opposed to doing another video like this for another Crash character, or just another series entirely if this one does well enough, and if you like my content then go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to support me further, consider becoming a YouTube channel member or joining my Patreon. Both of these go a long way in helping me create more videos for you all. I also stream on Twitch if you're interested in catching me live. Other than that, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.